being started. My name is Counselor Rudd, Counselor at Large. I see Counselor Hogan, Counselor Driscoll. Are there any other counselors on at the moment? Okay. The purpose of this meeting is to go over the overtime. There was a budget cut to overtime, so going over the implementation of that in regards to the adoption of the new timekeeping and payroll system. In general, the status of the overtime reduction, how call outs may be affecting overtime, or just in general, the protests and all that's happening. And then a summary. I want to go over the asset seizure funds and learn how much money that is and what it typically gets spent for, if possible. So with that agenda, is there anybody who would like to jump off with the overtime timekeeping?
Sure, Councilor. It's Joe Cecil. I'll share my face because I know you like to look at my face. We have Brian Lutz, who's I'm gonna try to share a document, and then he's gonna go over it with you. It covers pretty much everything you've asked for. And then certainly you can ask questions afterwards, but it goes over payroll, overtime, call outs, those things. And I'm gonna share that document right now. And then again, Brian Lutz can go over it.
Before Mr. Lutz goes, I would just add one more thing. We've had, traditionally there's a paper-based timekeeping system in the police department. We got roughly $2 million from the state to help implement a new timekeeping system. So that's the genesis of this change. And then the overtime budget was reduced from, I believe, 8 to 6.5 million in the fiscal year that began yesterday. But Brian, feel free to go.
Go ahead, Brian. Can everybody see that?
I think you're on mute, Brian.
Can see the document, but I can't. None of us can hear Brian. So
okay.
He may have to be, if anybody can unmute him, or if you can unmute yourself, Brian.
Can't seem to find him here. Oh, there he is. He's unmuted.
Brian, if you're having technical difficulties, you want to just walk over to my office. You can work off of my computer. I know you were having a problem with your mic. He's on his way over. He's going to take over my computer. No, come on this way. Come on this way.
Okay, sorry for the delay, everybody. Had technical difficulty there. Obviously, you can see the document that Chief Cecil put on the screen. I'm just going to kind of run through it and give you the overview. The first thing was the Chronos system that Councilor Rudd mentioned. We dealt with IT Director Dave Proack back in February. Obviously, prior to COVID, that was a priority for the city IT department to get that project up and running. From our standpoint, it didn't happen. We spoke with Chronos in a couple of phone meetings, looking for training materials, things to get that off the ground, but that never materialized. So as of this point, we don't have an update as to when that project is going to begin, and when things are going to be asked of us to get that system up and running. I believe that Chief Buckner mentioned that a project manager for that is being hired through City Hall at this point, but I can't give you an update on that from our end.
Brian, this is Frank Kaliba. I don't want to interrupt. I'm happy to provide that update when it fits into your presentation. I don't want to interrupt your presentation.
Well, it sounds like on this point, the time would probably be now, because it seems like his answer is they don't have one. So
yeah. So between the two IT departments that are required here, the county and the city, obviously at right after the February, what was supposed to be the formal February kickoff meeting, the focus began shifting towards getting several hundred people working remotely and working to build those systems. So implementing a new system was just not feasible and went on the back burner. We have hired a project manager. That project manager starts next week, who will be taking over Kronos and getting it back on track. So we expect to be getting a significant amount of traction here in the near future. So in the careful what you wish for bucket, the SPD will be engaged extensively in the next few days.
It sounds
okay,
good.
okay. So just to go back and forth maybe a bit here, Frank, and other counselors who have a memory, feel free to. I kind of thought we talked about this during the budget season. The budget season happens in April, like early, mid-April. And I'm pretty sure we asked about how this was all going. And I think at that time, the answer was still the summer. Like in the summer, we should be up and running.
We should be testing this summer. The goal was always to have SPD. The target was always fall for SPD, but we should be up in a test environment this summer.
What will a testing environment look like and mean?
It would mean that the initial rules and parameters for the system have been largely built, and they're running them in a test environment, usually in parallel with the existing paper system, and looking for any holes in the logic and any problems with the data input interfaces and the reporting output, and working to see how making sure that it works with the other systems. So testing doesn't take over for the existing system. It runs in parallel inside a sandbox so that it can't hurt anything. And then as the kinks are worked out of it, you move from the testing to a live environment, but still running in parallel with the existing. So you've got both systems running live, and then eventually phase out the existing system and just leave the new system standing. That's the normal protocol. I'm not going to speak for the project manager. She may have her own approach to it, but that's the general approach to the way you introduce this kind of a system, Council.
I seem to not see Dave Proack, so I guess, Frank, you can speak to him. So it seems the answer is that we should have probably been doing this in March, but COVID happened. We had to focus on working remotely. Dave and his 5 coworkers or whatever, they had to focus on making that possible. So this basically got frozen in time. So does Dave and his group actually have time to deal with it now? Like, how much of a delay are we looking at? When do we anticipate that the other competing priorities will not be above this one?
Well, the point of bringing in a project manager is that a lot of the systems work can fall on Kronos and on the county, because we're actually working on top of a county platform. So which was our initial roadblock at the end of last year, was getting the county to update their system so that it could accept the scheduling system that we needed. So once that got taken care of, Kronos was, and our IT department with Dave was intending to step in, do the project management, and start populating the new system. And that's what got frozen in time, as you put it, with the advent of COVID. So the project manager should be able to take that, the city IT piece on largely, not completely, but largely, and start overseeing the build out of the algorithms that are required with SPD. So a lot of the initial work requires mapping the existing system into Kronos, and that largely is going to fall on SPD, but they need to know how to do it. As Brian said, they need to be trained on how to do that. And the project manager can work with Kronos in place of Dave Proack and his team having to do that and make sure that it happens.
So originally we weren't going to fill that kind of position, and then we adjusted to do that.
We were not going to have a dedicated project manager.
So so that's like a cost increase to this effort? Is that?
We are building it into the budget with FRB.
What's the cost of that position? That's roughly.
I apologize. I don't remember off the top of my head what we hired it at.
So that goes into Dave's budget, or that goes into police budget?
It's in Dave's budget, but will be reimbursed by FRB dollars.
By FRB, okay. Other counselors on this project, questions?
Frank, this project manager has extensive knowledge of Kronos and similar situation maybe in her resume.
I'd be happy to supply her resume. She's got extensive systems integration, not Kronos and PeopleSoft directly, but similar kinds of systems, and the ability to, a demonstrated ability to jump in and get working pretty quickly. We're really comfortable she's going to hit the ground running.
Okay.
A lot of the work, Councilor Hogan, will be working with Kronos. A big part of what we pay Kronos for is the integration work. Her job is to keep everybody aligned. So between our systems people, the county, really, the county system people, and Kronos, she's the one who herds the cats, as it were. So she knows the language both of users and of the systems people, and knows how to build a systems integration project. But I'll be happy to send along her resume. She's a pretty impressive woman.
Thank you, Frank.
Councilors, I see Councilor Green and Councilor Majuk have also joined.
So I'm trying to understand what is the, I guess my understanding of this would mean that obviously from your presentation here is going to save us money. And so is the understanding is the issue here that prior to this machine or this system, that somehow we were losing money based on how we were keeping time?
So I want to be careful, Counselor, in saying that we are going to, that the system itself will directly save money. Where the system will be more efficient and will make right now we input overtime data. So any time and attendance outside of norm, so overtime, paid time off, all those things, largely manually handled and input multiple times. So there's an inherent inefficiency and error, being prone to errors. So there's where we will save some. There will be some savings. What the system is designed to do is provide accuracy and transparency so that time can be better managed. So it in and of itself is not going to provide us savings, but what it will do is provide SPD or DPW or any of the other departments that have significant amount of scheduling and overtime encumbrances, very clear view that they do not have now into where their overtime is, how it's being spent, who is taking that overtime, so how it's being allocated, if that's being done appropriately, and then the idea being with that transparency, you'll be able to manage it. SPD is very confident that with that kind of a clear vision of the overtime, for example, that they will be able to better manage it and manage it down. But the system itself doesn't automatically provide that savings.
And where I'm trying to go with this, Frank, is I'm trying to understand. And initially, I understood why this system was wanted and why we wanted to put it in place. But to say that having this system is somehow going to improve efficiency, and that efficiency is translated into money, in which I see here, what is that, $388,000? And out of that efficiency, somehow, what I'm trying to understand here is how that efficiency could be quantified or translated into this much money. I'm trying to have you explain to me how this system could save us much money. That mean that we were losing this much money? That's my question.
Two different. This is the overtime reduction is the efforts that Brian's going to talk about that have been going on inside of SPD in parallel with, but aside from the system. I'm speaking solely to the Kronos time and attendance system. But the 388 is savings that's aside from Kronos, Council.
I would just say that we spend a lot of money. We don't schedule effectively. There's all kinds of incentives to encourage like lots of overtime for officers. So this is this more timely one. It's going to be more efficient. So we're not going to have 3 people processing paper slips, and the officers won't have to deal with paper slips, but we'll have it automated. But then that automation provides more information to the managers to actually plan and schedule effectively and hold people accountable to manage to like making that a reality. So yes, I think the assumption is there is a high amount of inefficiency in the way that overtime currently occurs. From my perspective, there may be people who disagree, and that's fine. But certainly the idea is that this will help us reduce overtime use. And
not just in
it starts
100% and not just
the
in,
biggest,
yeah.
But it's going to go to the whole city. So it's
throughout the entire city. We are highly inefficient in the way we manage time and attendance and overtime.
Anyone else on the implementation? So on this point, when were we supposed to start the rule making in order to be testing in the summer? And when you say summer, can I pretend it was July 1st? And so now we're talking about fall testing, I think. So is that September 1st, or is that October 31st, or is that December 20th?
I want to be careful about redoing the timeline before I've had the opportunity to sit down with the project manager, Counselor. But the targets I'm going to provide to her would have us still testing at the end of the summer, early fall, and hopefully up and running, fully debugged by end of the calendar year.
Running by the end of the calendar year, hopefully.
That would be the goal. So we would be somewhere in the 45 to 90 days late from the original targets.
Before we move on to the next point. That's Josiah. Okay, do we want to read through that second bullet? Number 2.
Okay, Counselor?
Yes, Counselor Hogan, go ahead.
I'm unclear under number one. Certainly overall overtime spending decreased $388,000 from year 19, which congratulations to the police department on that and under the leadership of Chief Buckner. But it says when adjusted, I'm a little puzzled by that. Certainly the protests drove up the overtime, I imagine, but weren't they offset by the many events that were scheduled? I'm thinking like the St. Patrick's Day Parade, et cetera, all that summer events that I used to be involved in when I was with the Parks Department. Are we fully reimbursed from that? Leads me to believe that we're fully reimbursed for police overtime during all those events. Is that true, Brian or Chief Cecil?
Counselor, the events are kind of case by case. Something like the St. Patrick's Day Parade, we're not reimbursed for. There's other
you don't want to
various
charge the Irish, that's for sure, obviously.
There's other various festivals that have been canceled due to COVID that we might have been reimbursed for. It's hard to give you a definitive answer there. What the adjusted number shows, it's that 388 plus to date the approximately 430 to 50,000 for protests. And then there's about another 300,000 or so that is COVID related that the city is hoping to get reimbursed by FEMA for, but that reimbursement has not been filed for or received yet.
Would you be able to segue or loop in those special units that Chief Trudell's put on the street for some sort of COVID reimbursement? Because you could always make the case that because of how COVID's affected the neighborhoods of the city, that might have led to the activities, those illegal activities that the special units are for. Is that something we could try?
Depending on why those units were put out there, it may fit in the FEMA
I'm thinking
guidelines.
of the fireworks unit and the unit on the smaller vehicles, the illegal ATVs and all that.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly get with Chief Trudell. We can discuss whether or not it might fit and include that when we could do the paperwork.
Okay.
Could Pat repeat that question about the AT? What did he say about the ATVs, please?
Chief, I said that I know in our history with FEMA, I'm thinking about years ago when we actually had FEMA reimbursement for a huge windstorm we had that devastated the city a bunch of years ago. We were able to fold a lot of the activities if we could prove that they were related to that particular disaster. And COVID certainly is a disaster. So I'm just wondering if we can make an attempt to maybe some of those special overtime units that Chief Trudell's put on the street, you put on the street, we could fold them into maybe some sort of reimbursement from FEMA.
Okay.
Just a suggestion. That's all I got, Councilor Rudd.
Anybody else? On number 2, as I read it, the police department has implemented a budgeting and a reporting system under which the following occurs. Historical overtime expenditures are reviewed and evaluated. Overtime budgets are developed based on areas of our operation that are critical to the safety of the citizens. Monthly reports are provided to bureau chiefs, identifying trends in spending. The trends are reviewed and evaluated to ensure best use of available funds. Okay, so we were at a meeting on codes, and I talked about we often have these plans, and we say we're going to do this, and we're really generic, and then we don't populate the detail of how we're going to achieve the goals. We just speak in generality, and I sort of feel that way with this. So do we have any kind of projection that takes your like a staffing table that basically says, here are all our shifts, here are all our overhead, here are all our, we require this many hours of people. And then so that's sort of like your demand for officers, right? Based on what the work that you've defined to do. And then you have a supply of officers, which is based on your current roster. So it would need, and then it would need to include like the work rules associated with those individuals. So like if certain officers get more holidays, it would account for that. So based on you having these 400 officers, you have this many hours available. And then to the extent you have a deficit, you have overtime. And you could control overtime by reducing the things you do or by hiring more people. So does the department have, and I know you have Jesse cases, so I hope you're working toward this if you don't already have it, but is there any kind of model that shows a projection based on like historical data, how it works and how you can actually control to be within, like I imagine there should be a projection for the next 2 weeks or the next month. And maybe July is always more overtime than any time else because it's summer and because there's more violence, but also because officers take vacation. Like there would be a whole lot of things that could go into this sort of projection. So when you say we have implemented a budgeting and reporting system, do you have that kind of capability? Do you have anything that does that? Can you share that? Can you show it with us, even if it's in private?
We have, so let me step in here a little bit. So we have like a top 20 things that we spend overtime on as it relates to categories. And then when you look at those categories, we can quantify, over the past 2 to 3 years as to how much money we've spent in these specific categories, and then be in the neighborhood as from a projecting standpoint as to what we expect to be able to spend to that. Part of your frustration is you all are looking for silver bullets, absolutes, or something tangible to be able to say, if we do X, then it will result in Y. There's too many things beyond our control to project in our business. For example, how many shootings are we going to have next week? How many of them will carry us over beyond the 8-hour day to where CID is working 16-hour days in an attempt to try to find the 3 people responsible for these 2 homicides? How many more ride day incidents or something close or similar to that will we experience? Now, we can put it on our list that, hey, we're not going to supply police officers for this special detail anymore for free. And
Chief,
then
if I could interrupt right there on for instance, that point about shootings, I think that's a fair point that those incidents create the need for additional police staffing, which you didn't plan on, which inherently create more overtime. But even then, if you had this type of projection, you could build assumptions around what a typical shooting does to your staffing need, right?
And to that point, we have built budgets to where every captain, every deputy chief has a budget that was built upon historical data for the first time with them individually that they will be given. And it's a couple of days late because obviously we're 2 days into our new budget, but I just approved that. So they will have the money that they have to spend for the 21 budget year. Here's the problem. Then the stuff starts because we can say, well, we're no longer in the pool business because we can no longer afford to do it until it becomes political. We can say, hey, it's not our job to provide free police service to these special events. If you have a ticketed event and you're charging people to attend, then you must pay for an off-duty police officer until you get a phone call. So all of these things that we say that we want to do, these hard lines in the sand, we're more than prepared to do them. The question is are you willing to go through it with us? Because we can say no. We have no problem saying no. The question is, who's going to stand there with us when the consequences of the services that we no longer offer police for, who's going to stand with us and say, hey, sorry about your luck. You want cops, you got to pay for it. We're no longer.
So I understand what you're saying, and it's a fair point. At the same time, I would say, okay, let's say we have, when you look at the things historically, I think you would see there's more violence in the summer, there's more violence on the weekend. So scheduling historically will help minimize that effect. But then to the extent like if one shooting happens on a Friday, I imagine we should have the staffing to cover it. And if not, I would say something went wrong with the staffing. But if 7 shootings happen on a Friday, that may blow the plan. But then you could point and you could say, look, on this date, we had 7 shootings. Because of that, we had to call in 4 additional officers for, or whatever it may be. But there should be some sort of, instead of just like, we called in 50 additional officers, which might be the case, or 200 additional officers if they're breaking the windows of the public safety building. But there should be a measure of account to say, here is where we went wrong, and I don't totally feel that system is in place yet. It's just that we know we blew the plan because a bunch of stuff didn't work out, because a bunch of stuff was different than we anticipated. But we never had like a defined record, right?
Understood, and I agree with you. I think that what we will share with you and the committee, Councilman Rudd, is the budgets that now that every deputy chief and every captain has in their hand as their guide for this year. And because one of the new things that we've adopted is to be great for 8. If it's not something catastrophic, it's not something a dire emergency after your 8 hours. If we're budget tight, or if you have money to spend on overtime, put a detail out of your Trudell, you can spend it as long as you have the money. If we don't have it, absent something kind of extenuating circumstances, after your 8 hours, we're done. So just we want to put that in your hands so you can see why they're telling you all no when you call them.
So just to dig into like the point around, like, for instance, a violent weekend where you have to call people in or something, I would say there's different events that could create the need for overtime. So you could have like a big, huge security event or shootings or whatever it may be, but it could also be that it's a typical night where more than typical officers called out, right? That would also create spending for overtime. And I also think it would be fair to say, this happened. We scheduled 28 people, 14 came in. We had to call 14. And right now, I don't get, maybe it's because I'm not asking enough, but I don't see that level of kind of like sharing in terms of how the overtime actually happens.
I think that some of your questions will be answered. Many of your questions will be answered once you see the budget, and then what went into the budget. How do we come about these numbers that were given to the deputy chiefs? To your point, some of this is management. For example, if I'm paying minimum staffing overtime because I allowed 7 people to take a vacation day, and then that dropped me below my minimum staffing. Well, that's not a budget issue. That's a supervisory issue, because you should have only allowed 4 people off from work if you knew you were that close to your minimum staffing. That's where lieutenants, captains, and deputy chiefs have to step in to make sure that we're doing what we need to do from a management standpoint. The other thing is midterm, long term, we have to look at maybe some of the contract language. For example, we had an incident to where we were preparing for, based upon intelligence, something significant happening during the protest period, and we had to call in a group of people based upon what we were seeing. Well, right as they arrived to get there, everything kind of dissipated. What we thought was going to happen, it didn't happen. The problem is everybody that activated got a minimum of 4 hours of overtime because the contract calls for that. So there's a whole lot of stuff in this pot of why we are at this overtime number. But in order for us to wrap our arms around it, we're going to management-wise have to do a better job, and then we're also going to have to answer some of these painful questions of what exactly business is the Syracuse Police Department conducting, and what are we willing to give up?
So just so I'm understanding, you're saying you're going to share those the captain level budgets with the counselors? So
you will have the budgets that they have. Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Other counselors, questions on this point of managing overtime in general?
Counselor, I just wanted to comment a little bit about the chief. We're not looking for a silver bullet, chief. We're just trying to do our job. These questions come to us from our constituents. We ask them of every city department. regarding overtime and how they spend their money. The people expect us. And as far as like standing with the police department, I probably over my career as a city councilor have attended at least 200 neighborhood meetings. And just for your, I know you're probably familiar, having I seen you at a couple of meetings. People in this city, in the neighborhoods, ask for more cops all the time. They don't ask for less cops. So I'm not of the defund police party at all. But we need to ask these questions, and we're simply trying to get the answers. And I appreciate you giving them to us. That's all I got. Thanks, Chief.
Councilor Rudd, if I may, I think oftentimes though, serious consideration has to be given. And again, I don't make the statement under the assumption that it's not, but I can only go by the context of the discussion. Has to be given to the fiscal state of the city, and simply what's the matter of our ability, right, or what our ability will be in the coming future. You know, and I hate to use a very simple example, but it's true. You know, if any of you were challenged to do a cartwheel in a 2-foot by 2-foot closet, you'd likely be unsuccessful. And all we're talking about here is the amount of space you have to move in. And so fiscally, we have a certain amount of space to move in. And as this number continues to increase, we will exceed that space, and then the city itself will be in trouble. You know, and it's been talked about, certainly since I've been here, maybe even before I've been here, that we're often facing that kind of challenge fiscally. I think that has to be understood, because the bottom line is if we run out of money, nobody will be here. At that point, what argument is made? So in order to assure that we can all perform to the best of our ability, you know, we have to make sure this city remains fiscally solvent. You know, I think, you know, this is not to the chief or any of the deputy chiefs or anybody on the call, but certainly we've heard those arguments before, that any statement relative to money is anti-police. You know, and the only thing I can say to that is for those individuals, they're very short-sighted, and it doesn't even warrant a response. Because the bottom line, again, is if the money runs out, none of us will be here. So we have to be clear about why we have these discussions. Discussions with the state over unfunded mandates has been an argument since before I got elected. It's not new. So it's not a blame on this council or anybody here. It's been talked about for the longest. You know, I mean, before Cuomo was elected, it was a discussion. You know, since Cuomo has been elected, there's been appeals made by certainly the previous administration, previous councilors, and maybe now even this administration, I'm not sure, but certainly by myself, that some of these, that we get some kind of unfunded mandate relief, which has not happened. And that question is asked because at some point we will reach a tipping point, and we're trying to avoid that tipping point as much as we can. So I just want to kind of state that and make it clear. And while Chief, I understand your point, you know, about the fact that, you know, we have to decide what services we won't provide. I don't believe that's an option in regards to what services we will or won't provide. You know, we as electeds and similarly, you as officers, we don't get that choice to determine what we will and will not provide. You know, what we have to do is find the best way to keep it going. And I believe that's the effort here. I think it's equally the effort of the police department. We just got to find that medium. That's all I got, Counselor.
Thank you. Well said. Anyone else? Nobody? Okay. With that, we're roughly 2/3 through the meeting, which is perfect because I think we can move on to the seizure money. Who wants to deliver the prepared answer?
Lieutenant Lutz, I think you have some information about the seizure funds.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get the document so everybody. Okay, just kind of an overview in case people aren't familiar. When it comes to the federal equitable sharing, or what we call seizure money, it's governed by the Guide to Equitable Seizure for state, local, and tribal law enforcement agencies. The DOJ oversees it and provides some basic directives. the most important of which is that the funding can only be used by law enforcement for law enforcement purposes. They're very clear about that. I've been to several trainings where they have emphasized that that is one thing. If the DOJ gets wind isn't happening, they will swoop in and potentially cut us off from the program, cut us off from funding. Just going a little further with that, the funds have to be used to increase or supplement the resources we have, meaning that supplanting can't happen. Just because we have seizure money in the account at our disposal doesn't mean our budget can be reduced because we have another funding source. And like I said, the DOJ, will terminate our relationship with them if they find any of these rules are broken. Moving on, the guidebook that I mentioned provides some very specific guidance as to what that money can and can't be used for. In point 3, I attached the web link in case any of the councilors are interested in reviewing that document. It states very, very clearly what you can and can't do. And then the New York State Equitable Sharing Guidelines essentially follow the federal ones. I don't have a formal document available on the web or anywhere else, but that's the guidance that we have always been told. Any questions on that part before I get into the number specifics?
Just so everybody knows, can you just describe briefly the process? So like there's an arrest, something's taken, it's sold, the money goes to this larger account. Like, can you explain just that briefly?
Yeah, so briefly, right off the top, one important point is in order to be involved in this program, we have to have a task force relationship with a federal agency, whether it be DEA, FBI, IRS, some federal source that we're partnering with to share information on cases, conduct investigations, ultimately make arrests and potentially seizures. So once that's in place and those things happen, we submit paperwork to the DOJ, which talks about our involvement in the investigation, whether it was we provided officers working on the case, surveillance, whether we provided informants, basically documenting all the time that we put into the investigation that could have been used on other things. Basically, it's the way for the feds to reimburse us for manpower that's devoted to a federal investigation instead of another avenue. So we that and we request a percentage of it. DOJ then reviews the paperwork and they determine, we might get 10%, 20%, 30%, depending on how much manpower and resources we devoted to the investigation and on the ultimate disposition of the investigation in court.
Okay, I guess go into the numbers.
Okay, because I know you had asked about it, Councilor Rudd. There is a federal equitable sharing agreement certification form that we're required to file annually. Its year runs the same as the city fiscal year. So as we go through this, you'll have the numbers that were filed for fiscal 19. Fiscal 20 ended 2 days ago, so that filing is not yet completed. The current balance in the federal seizure account is approximately $480,000. Obviously, as you see, I have not forwarded this to you, but I will get that over to you so that you can review it. For fiscal 19, the last year we reported on, the major expenses related to travel and training. Those courses consisted of force science training, training for our polygraph officers, body-worn camera training, and then we sent some officers to Equal Employment Opportunity Commission training. So that was the bulk of the money we spent during fiscal 19.
So I'm confused on one part. So I could have an account. I mean, the question that I had asked earlier, setting up the meeting, is how much did you spend related to asset seizures each of the last 2 years? And both times I got a response of the current balance is approximately $500,000. So I could have an account that has $500,000 balance on July 1, and then I could get $10 million and I could spend all 10 million, and on June 30th I could have an account that had $500,000 in it. Or I could have $500,000 on July 1 and I could get $1 and I could spend the $1, and then on June 30th I have $500,000 in the account. So I find, how much do you spend each year?
Yeah, I see I did not include the total for fiscal 19 there. My apologies for that. I do have it for fiscal 20 down below. I will get you a definitive.
Where is that amount? I'm sorry, I don't see it.
If we want to skip ahead, if you go down to point 4, A, the fiscal 20-year expenditures were 22,735. Again, I don't have the fiscal 19 total in front of me. I'll get it to you.
So are you like, you have an account with $500,000 that you spent 22,000 last year? Is it typically that way, that there's a huge like amount in it, but we just spend a very small amount?
It varies. Of that 480,000, we currently have approximately 200,000 that's earmarked for the real-time crime center project that is being conducted here at the PSB. It's actually, is Deputy Chief McGork on the call?
I'm here, Brian.
Can you kind of speak to what that is a little bit, sir?
Yeah, so I spoke to the council. Hello, everybody. I spoke to the council about the real-time crime center probably about 7 or 8 months ago. We've entered into, we have the Crime Analysis Center here in Syracuse, which is a state-run crime center that provides intelligence for law enforcement agencies throughout the county. What we're moving toward is a real-time crime center where they have the ability to work extended hours, different days, and provide real-time intelligence to, officers responding to calls, to detectives investigating cases. But in an effort to do that, we had to build out the space and invest quite a bit of money. And so I know Councilor Hogan, I don't believe, was on the council when I came to speak on it prior to. I think everybody else was probably present. But if there are specific questions regarding it, please let me know. But that's, so we do have, Brian's correct, we have roughly $200,000 earmarked to be spent for the engineers on the project, the actual construction on the project, and all of that.
So is there, I understand you send a report to DOJ. I understand we don't see the report. Is there a reason why we don't see the report? Are we not allowed to see the report? Because the way Lieutenant Lutz described it, it seems like this is them reimbursing us for, our city taxpayers paid for police services that helped raise funds for the feds because of what they resulted. So they're basically reimbursing taxpayers. But then, at least my impression is that we don't have as much transparency around how we spend this. And I sort of feel that the lack of transparency may actually cause a more visceral or suspicious reaction than is actually warranted if there was transparency. So can you speak to if you're allowed to share, not allowed to share, how much detail you can or can't give, and why? Because I sort of feel like this is one of those points where because of the lack of transparency that I've perceived to this point, I'm far more suspicious than may be warranted. So.
Yeah. So, Councilman Rudd, if I want to make sure I'm understanding you correctly, you said your level of suspicion is based upon not knowing how much we're reimbursed or what we're spending it on is your concern?
Yeah, like the basics. Like I basically was like, I feel like when I first asked the questions, a lot of people were like, oh, we don't really know. And then the answers were, well, we give it to DOJ, but they don't give it to us. Or the police department gives it to DOJ. So it's one of those things where it makes it like, so we can't see it. So I think we're like, well, why can't we see it? And what actually happens when we can't see it? So Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. It makes sense. Now Lutz is much more intimately involved in this than obviously any of us. I don't know if there's anything that forbids us from telling you what we have. I think that the language is clear about um, how or what the money that can be spent on is where you see police get sensitive, and I understand that because you don't want to be kicked out of the program. So what we have or how much we're reimbursed or something, I don't know of a reason why we would not be able to share that with the folks who are the stewards of the city's departments from a certainly from a financial standpoint, but with the clear understanding that latitude over those dollars is restricted to police.
Right. So I'm willing to say that, yeah, I understand the restrictions. I just would like I think there's a million ways you all could probably spend the money that makes sense. Like the real-time crime center seems like an appropriate use of the funding, but in my opinion, but if you haven't been presented with, well, in fiscal year 19 it was 30,000 and it purchased these 20 things with some amount of detail, and then in fiscal year 20 it was 22,000 and we have this hold of 400,000 for the real-time crime center, that's why there's so much money in the account. That would be really effective for me to share with a citizen when they say, oh, they're spending $500,000 a year on asset forfeiture and they're going golfing. It's this is the when we don't know it, it becomes harder to diffuse what might be misinformation out there. So if you can share that, I would very much like to see just the amount of spending and the plan and how it was spent. And it can totally be within the framework of you have to spend it on this stuff, but I would just like you to be saying we're spending it on this stuff.
Gotcha. We could get you that information of what we're spending, what we have, the amount that they're reimbursing us, all of those the questions that I'm understanding that you're asking. But with the understanding, again, our pushback is going to come from if someone is trying to, outside of PD, trying to tell us how we can spend the money.
All right. So I just want to be clear. At the moment, I'm in no way telling you how to spend your asset seizure money, but I'm in every way trying to understand how much asset seizure money you have and what purchase with it.
Yes, sir. More than reasonable.
Thank you.
Councilor Rudd, can I have a quick question?
Yes, sir.
Chief, would body cameras be something to be eligible for this money?
I don't know. I can tell you that I've seen some equipment. Is obviously something that multiple times that I've seen departments use the money for. The one thing that I guess the first question I would have would be for Lutz would be if it's something that we already have in the form of body cameras. Would that considered be supplanting because we already have a program? I don't know those questions. And a lot of those are the types of questions, Councilman Green, that we have to shoot up to the feds to make sure that we're not getting our hands slapped. But I can tell you, I've seen like one-time equipment purchase, but I don't know about ongoing programs and things that you have if it can be used for that. When we obviously grants that are specifically for a program like that, we obviously see that because we see that was the meat and potatoes of our body worn camera. But state and federal funds for that, I don't know. Lieutenant Lutz, for an existing program, do you have any thoughts on that?
My thoughts are the same as yours, Chief. I would certainly want to run it through DOJ before we did something like that. You're absolutely correct. If it's a one-time purchase of equipment that wasn't previously budgeted for, that's no problem. But the ongoing one, I would want a ruling from the feds.
Yeah, because I just know it's something a lot of people have been talking about. I know we might not have enough money in our budget to be able to get them as quickly as we would want to. So, and maybe it's working with corporate counsel too, if they can help kind of interpret that DOJ opinion. It just might be a good thing to kind of be able to get that program expanded to where we want it to be relatively quickly.
The problem too is, Councilman Green, is more often than not, the Seize funds allow us to do things that we would otherwise be not able to do. For example, trying to make sure that our commanders are certified in these professional law enforcement training exercises, or ensuring that we send our polygraph folks to get their renewal or something like. I'm just bringing up examples, but training purposes is a big part of that, of using those funds for. And when you talk about examples that we're using here as the body-worn cameras, let's say they said that, okay, you can use it for the body-worn cameras. Well, if we have $500,000 and we take 350 of it and put it as a supplement to the cameras, not only have we we're impacting what we would historically use those dollars for, because the budget does not support those things. So I just want to make sure that I put that out there. That's something that may appear to be something that the funds can be used for. There are historical things that just about every year we can count on spending Seize funds for. And the other one, the main one, is the furtherance of the types of investigations or the things that resulted in the Seize funds in the first place. So if we don't keep that item from churning out Seize dollars, if I'm making sense to you, that's how your Seize funds get they dry up.
Yeah, no, I understand. I just want to make sure, you know, if we're able to buy these cameras by the end of the year, that we don't have to do it by taking from other sources within the city. I mean, obviously we're crowdfunding to keep pools open, so any dollar we can find to achieve the policy goals we want would be good.
How on average, how much do your department get from this a year?
It varies greatly, Counselor. As you'll notice on the document there, during fiscal 19, there was actually zero. That had to do with, at that time, we were not involved in any of the federal task force I mentioned. Over the last year or so, we've gotten back into several of those, and we've churned in about 100,000 this year. But it really can depend. Some of those investigations can be 3, 6, 12-month investigations. We have seizure requests we've submitted that are 4 or 5 years old that are still going through court proceedings. So we don't know what we may get, when we may get it, or if we'll get anything. So it's very unpredictable what's going to come in.
Do they usually come from things like, you know, drugs and other things, or is that sensitive stuff?
Typically, I mean, the assets that are seized have to be an asset with financial value to it, whether it's cash itself, cars, houses, stocks and bonds. The drugs themselves have no value to them. So we don't get anything directly, you know, from the drugs. It might be a drug investigation that yields those other things.
I mean, when I mean drugs money. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So just given that, I initially asked for the last 2 years, the amount and the spending, but given the description of it varies greatly, do you think you could make it 5 years so that we get a sense of the variation and then how the money gets used, given the variation? Again, yeah, not with me saying, don't spend it on this, spend it on the pools, but with me saying, I would like to know what you're spending. And I reserve the right to say, I think you could spend it differently, but on your own police operations within the framework of what you're charged with. And maybe you spend it optimally. I'm open to that too. But I would like to be able to see it and understand it.
Yeah, we can get you 5 years, Counselor. That's not a problem.
Thank you. We're going to wrap up in a minute, but anybody who hasn't had a chance, counselors, to chime in?
Counselor.
With that, I think this was a very effective meeting. I appreciate everybody from PD Chief included, and all the counselors. All the answers aren't always what we want to hear, but it's good to hear them and for them to be out in the public so that we're understanding what's happening moving forward. So I appreciate it.
Councilman Rudd, can I give a little closing?
Absolutely, Chief. Go for it.
I want to be on record that the Syracuse Police Department does not subscribe to or believe that you do more with less. You will never hear that from us. You get less with less. We want to be on record with that. We do not subscribe to, nor do we believe that you get more with less. That's all I
would
have,
just
sir.
point back to Councilor Bay's very eloquent point about the space for which we have, and sometimes the space for which we have to do a cartwheel gets smaller. In which case, sometimes we have to make a decision to do less. So I would just put that there as well, but we're not unaware of that trade-off. So. Thank you. All right, with that, we could close it out. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Have a good day.